Buyurun hocam.
İngilizceye switch edelim o zaman.
Yes.
So let me start by, first of all, thanking for this really kind invitation to Bilkent University Social Sciences Research Society. It was, as I was telling Onurcan, a true pleasure to listen to the earlier presentations, which were all very inspirational, really thought-provoking. And I'm sure our presenters also really enjoyed the discussions they had with our students. Before I start my presentation, let me briefly introduce myself for those of you who haven't met me. I'm Merih Angın. I'm an assistant professor at Koç University's College of Administrative Sciences and Economics, where I lecture at the International Relations Department and the Computational Social Sciences graduate program. Before joining Koç University, I was a postdoctoral fellow at the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs of Harvard University. And earlier, I was a postdoctoral research fellow at the Blavatsky School of Government of the University of Oxford. I hold a PhD degree in International Relations and Political Science from the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies, which we abbreviate as IHEID in French. And I also happen to have a bachelor's degree in economics from Bilkent University. It is another true pleasure to be presenting virtually at my alma mater, actually. And again, kudos to your society for establishing it to begin with and for organizing this summit, which I hope will become a tradition, as Akın Hoca also mentioned in his presentation. My own research interests lie in the areas of international political economy, international development, computational social sciences, as you all know, including agent-based modeling, machine learning, and artificial intelligence governance as well. So let me start my presentation. I think I do have sharing privileges. All right, let's see. Can you see it clearly? Because when I go full screen, it freezes, but if the screen is big enough for everyone to see clearly, I'll just stick to this mode. Okay, that's great. So before presenting the project, let me also talk a little bit about our lab. In September 2019, actually, I moved back to Turkey with TÜBİTAK's International Fellowship for Outstanding Researchers, which is basically a funding program that aims to attract researchers with international working experience to come back to Turkey to conduct research in Turkish academic institutions. And so the following month, I founded the MA Computational Social Sciences Lab, which is an interdisciplinary research laboratory bringing together researchers from really multiple disciplines, including economics, computer science, history, law, and of course, political science and international relations. So the pictures of people you see here, actually, they all come from multiple disciplines. And the project that I will present to you today is actually part of an extensive research that we're conducting in our lab with my dear colleagues and research assistants, including Onurcan. Actually, we don't have his picture here, but we'll have an updated version soon, hopefully. The work they do or in our lab is really invaluable input. So I shall acknowledge that before I start my talk, and throughout my presentation, I will always refer to the project as our project because as I said, the labor that they put into this project is really priceless for us. And well, going back to what I was saying, as I said, this is actually a really extensive research project, including statistical analysis, machine learning, agent-based modeling, natural language processing, and process tracing. And since it wouldn't be possible to really present you all of these in 40 minutes, I've decided to pick NLP part, which is really what we're also really focusing on in the lab at the moment. But since we're developing a domain-specific NLP tool, I also want to make sure that you're all familiar with this domain before I move on to the technical details. And so there will also be debut to the IMF lending, which is at the very core of the project. So here's the deadline of my presentation for you today. We'll start with our research question, moving on to the objectives of the project. I will then present you my two-level principal agent model, again, which is really what the entire research is built on. Then we'll talk about my hypothesis, the data we use, the other methods that we're using apart from NLP, and then I'll move on to the NLP part before concluding the presentation. All right, so let's start with the IMF. So as much as I really doubt this is a crowd that needs an intro to the IMF, just to brush up a little bit on what we already know about this organization. The IMF, as you all know, is an international financial institution that was established after the Second World War, which now has 190 member countries as of 2021. The IMF, which we usually refer to as the fund, is actually responsible for three mandates. A, monitoring the global economy and the member states' economies. B, providing loans to economies with balance of payments issues. And then C, giving advice to all of its member countries. So our project focuses on a really controversial aspect of the IMF's primary mission, that is lending to members in need of IMF finance. Why does the IMF offer sweeter deals to some countries over the others is a really popular question, both in academia and in other fields. Maybe we can start with that question. Do you have any arguments in mind? Let me turn to our audience. What could be some potential reasons for receiving better treatment from the IMF from the borrowing country perspective? Any ideas? Onurcan, you probably know the answers to this one, but please go ahead.
Yes. But I've been doing labeling a lot for your project, and I've seen many statements by the IMF officials, and I think it is safe to say that the perception of the country in the minds of these officials has a huge impact on the decisions taken, I think.
Mm-hmm. And you're right. And in the literature, we can say we have two camps. One focusing on more state-centric explanations, saying that the strategic allies of the United States or G5 countries in general tend to get sweeter deals from the IMF, versus the more constructivist perspective, constructivist as in IR theory constructivism, thinking that once established, an international organization actually has its own decision-making processes. And so the decision-making will actually depend on what the IMF staff thinks and its norms and procedures. And so there is a more technical decision-making process going on. These are two camps, I would say, in IMF studies. So this project basically tries to build a bridge between these two camps. Speaking of the economic and political processes, we believe that they actually both matter in the outcome, that is, the number and scope of IMF conditions attached to IMF loans, the loan size, and the conditionality waivers that a country receives. And so, again, just to clarify the research question, what factors influence the number and scope of an IMF program, scope of conditionality in an IMF program, and how do those factors play into shaping the design of programs are the questions that we try to answer in this project. Again, in the case of factors that influence the terms, we refer to the loan size, the number and scope of IMF conditionality, and waivers a country receives. Just to clarify what those mean, the loan size is pretty straightforward. It's the percentage of the exact amount weighed by the quota that you have. Normally, every country has a particular quota in the system, and it can borrow accordingly. But some countries actually borrow, let's say, sometimes 2-3 times more than their quota, depending on how much they need. But that's, again, something that is discussed at the executive board, whether that country would be granted that requested loan. Another thing that is part of the terms is, which is what is considered, I guess, more controversial, is the number of conditions. What is conditionality? These are basically the quantitative targets that a country needs to achieve while implementing the program, as well as some structural reforms that they need to implement in the country. So the conditions can be qualitative or quantitative in nature. So if a country is getting a large loan, let's say, they may be expected to walk the extra miles of making some major reforms, including changing their social security system, privatizing some state-owned enterprises, so on and so forth. So these are all called conditionality. And finally, the waivers. So an IMF loan is not dispersed in a single tranche. It will be dispersed in multiple tranches because the member country actually gets reviewed during the implementation of the program. So in order for a member country, a borrowing country, to receive the next disbursement of the loan, they need to actually get their review approved, that they fulfilled all the expectations, checking all the conditions. And the only way to get the next disbursement, if they actually haven't fulfilled these conditions, is to get a waiver. And that, again, is considered as a favor from the IMF side. And that's why we considered that as a better treatment if a country is getting lots of waivers. So I guess this is clear at this point. You don't really need to know the exact details, of course, of the disaggregated data that we use, but it's good to have a rough idea about what conditionality refers to. We'll keep repeating that over and over. But the, I guess, more interesting part for you is going to be the mixed methods that we use, because in order to answer these research questions, we actually employ mixed methods, as I said, including machine learning, NLP, statistical analysis, and process tracing also for the qualitative part, which I will explain more thoroughly in a bit. All right, so just to, again, summarize the objectives of the project. Well, we actually have what I say 3+1. The first one is creating a comprehensive machine learning model for predicting the loan size, conditions in different categories, and waivers during program implementation, and then complementing traditional statistical models to integrate a larger number of variables and provide high accuracy of prediction. That's one of them. The second one, which is the one that I'm going to focus on today, is to create an NLP tool for automated fast analysis of executive board meeting minutes, which is able to capture elements including individual board member sentiments. In the next step, alliance between representatives of different countries and the G5 country stance. By G5, I refer to the US, the UK, France, Germany, and Japan. And in this case, we actually expect to have at least 85% accuracy when cross-checked with the manual annotated analysis. The third objective is, of course, creating a comprehensive data set covering all IMF programs between 1978 until 2014. And the plus one is examining IMF behavior when it cooperates with European Union institutions by conducting what I mentioned earlier, process tracing on the cases of Romania and Greece, which will illuminate the causal mechanisms at play, but that is the very last leg of the research that we'll be working on hopefully next year. So in a nutshell, the research aims to really shed light on how IMF programs are formed, and the shortcomings in the literature inspired me to form, again, a comprehensive model, taking into account the impact of the relation between the IMF staff, the collaborating institution staff, in the case of Romania, that would be the European Union and the World Bank, and the recipient country bureaucrats, who are all delegated authority by their political principles on program design and implementation. So here I would like to talk briefly about the two-level principal agent model. Again, principal agent theory is something that we probably would need to spare another seminar time to thoroughly explain. It's a theory that is widely used in economics and business disciplines of sociology and political science. But just for the sake of presenting my own model, let me show you what it looks like for us. So I first formed this two-level model. At level one, we observed the negotiations between two agents, namely the IMF staff and the recipient country authorities. At level two, we go up in level. The principal agency problems between the political principles of these agents, the IMF executive board and the recipient government are analyzed. So I claim that in order to have a full picture of the principal agency problem in the design of IMF programs, which I believe is what is actually determining the number of conditions attached to the loans, as well as the loan amounts and waivers, we need to take into account both sets of relationships. So although the conventional wisdom expects the IMF to ease conditionality, again, as I said, when a strategic ally of the G5 countries are borrowing from the fund, what we observe in some cases is actually many strings attached to the loans, which is contradictory with the principal's preferences. We therefore surmise that in some cases, the staff had the leverage to push for more conditions attached to the loans, owing to the information asymmetry. By the same token, we actually have the hypothesis that the recipient country bureaucrats also gain more autonomy if the government is facing a severe economic crisis. Therefore, the scope of the crisis can actually affect the design of a program in two ways. The first one is straightforward. As it is an economic variable, the magnitude of the crisis is actually proportionate to the number of conditionality. The second one is a more indirect cause, as I've just explained. In that regard, we should expect increased conditionality, especially if there is a consensus among the technocrats of the international financial institution and the recipient country regarding the benefits of the conditions suggested in a program. The second variable, main explanatory variable, is the fragmentation in the political system, which equals to basically the number of the coalition partners in a government. Therefore, it is going to be coded as 1 if there is a single party government in power. That's quite straightforward. And then the model also examines what is termed as antinomic delegation as a possible cause of the principal agency problems in the program design, both at the international organization and in domestic level. So principal agency theory recognizes the presence of multiple or collective principles in bureaucracies who try to achieve goals that might sometimes be in conflict. And autonomic delegation is defined here as delegation consisting of complex or conflicting tasks that are difficult to institutionalize and implement. And in the presence of autonomic delegation, we cannot really blame performance problems only on agency shirking, as they may as well be caused by the difficulty agents are having in implementing goals that are challenging to specify and balance. So therefore, here we infer that the number of conditionality would be proportionate to the autonomic delegation, which emanates from the executive board's discontent with program design. So executive board's discontent is really the difficult part to measure based on the executive board meeting minutes, because they require researchers to form, first of all, a variable based on their own intuition. And measuring political economic processes are essentially difficult, which really limits the analyses on them to qualitative ones. And as a matter of fact, I mean, existing databases do not really have reliable proxies for many other important political economy variables, such as influence of special interest groups, for example. So in this project, we develop an automated analysis technique for executive board meeting minutes, which relies on NLP, natural language processing, to extract the executive board members' stances on IMF programs, including the discontent they express, so again, the level of solidarity between board members from different countries, and the views of G5 member countries on the program design. So, I mean, I already mentioned the data set that we use for the qualitative part, IMF executive board meeting minutes that we web scraped from the IMF's online archives. Apart from that, we also use IMF conditionality data set coming from Kantikilanis et al., which is a team based at University of Cambridge. The macroeconomic indicators, these are for statistical part, by the way, together with the machine learning part. We gather that from mostly from World Bank's database. But for the qualitative part, we also, I also am expected to do elite and expert interviews. Partly it's also already done, but with the qualitative parts, the intention is to actually do process tracing for methodological triangulation purposes. I actually focus on 3 country studies where we get variation in the dependent variable over time, in the dependent variable being number of conditionality or loan size or number of waivers. Just to quickly show, these 3 cases are Turkey, Romania, and Greece. In the case of Turkey, here you see the 1994 standby arrangement as well as 1999. We see a major jump in particularly in structural conditionality. So this is what a conditionality list looks like. We, of course, see a further jump in the 2001 program because Turkey was going through a major economic crisis while implementing the IMF program. But in any case, as the hypotheses that I showed you consider ecofinality to be at work, process tracing is actually a good technique that can really distinguish one process, causal process, from the other, because we're not trying to see mere correlations here. We are interested in the causal mechanisms connecting the dependent and independent variable. So I trace the causal processes then that explain this variation in number and scope of conditionality of the IMF programs implemented in the same country over time. That is where the puzzle is coming from. If a strategic ally of the United States always gets sweet deals from the IMF, then how do we explain the variation in the same country over time? That's where the case studies actually enter our picture. For again, the qualitative analysis, I don't only base the analysis on the executive board meeting minutes, also conduct interviews. For the case of Turkey, I conducted about 40 interviews with former bureaucrats, politicians. From the Turkey side, of course, the authorities who were engaged in designing the programs. And at the IMF side, I interviewed executive board directors, mission chiefs, resident representatives, and basically all the IMF staff who were engaged in designing the programs for Turkey during this time frame, 1994 up until 2008. For Romania, the time frame is 1994 up until 2005, and for Greece, 2010 until 2015. So, I mean, here you see pictures of each of these countries' protests in the country against the IMF. In some cases leading to social upheavals, and that's why we believe that it's important to see where this variation in conditions are coming from, how stringent the austerity measures also coming from. Okay, I show this. So as I'm running out of time, I still would like to, of course, talk about the computational social science part of the project. The earlier rather long intro was, again, for you to have an idea about what we are trying to do here. Let me also briefly talk about the machine learning leg of the research before moving on to NLP. I mean, we all know the recent advances in AI and high performance digital data processing architectures have really made it possible for us researchers to efficiently extract useful knowledge from various data sources in an automated / semi-automated manner. And machine learning, which enables not only the extraction of useful patterns, but also accurate forecasting of future events, of course, based on past events and current conditions, is really becoming an indispensable tool for economists in particular at international organizations to make estimations about macroeconomic variables in countries. And recent work really demonstrated that the use of machine learning techniques provides more accurate predictions of financial crises, currency crises, and economic variables than traditional statistical models that really place tighter restrictions on the relationship between dependent and independent variables. So while statistical models have high explanatory power for the relationship between variables and past data, ML models have high predictive power, which really makes them a powerful tool for tasks involving future predictions based on past data. So in this project, we take an ML approach to understanding the design of IMF programs by discovering how various economic and political variables and processes play together into shaping the program design outcomes in terms of conditionality, I mean, or loan size. So as opposed to statistical approaches, taking a hypothesis-driven approach to discovering correlations between dependent and independent variables, as I mentioned, ML models take a data-driven approach, which enables us, again, to more effectively build models with high predictive power. So the data-driven nature of machine learning models really allow for discovery of latent structures in large data, which could actually go unnoticed by humans and facilitates integration of many independent variables into the prediction processes, whose relative importance for the predictive outcome is revealed by the machine learning model itself. I mean, here in this figure, I try to provide an overview of a machine learning process. In this project, we actually employ supervised machine learning techniques, which each sample in the training data set has a class label attached to it, and the label indicates whether a specific conditionality category existed in a specific IMF program, or whether a waiver was granted for a specific conditionality, and within what range the total loan size granted in an IMF program was. All the three different dependent variables I mentioned in the beginning. So the task here is to predict the class label of each data point, where each data point is composed of a set of feature values, i.e. a feature vector, which are the values of the independent variables in program design. And the machine learning model is trained with the prepared training set, which enables the model to learn the relationships between the dependent and independent variables and how values of them, the independent variables varying together, affect the program outcome without having to introduce control variables. The accuracy of the model is evaluated by letting the trained model predict the class labels of the data samples in the data set and comparing the prediction results with the actual class labels. The model parameters are refined through repeating the training procedure until the best possible prediction results are achieved. So the prediction problem in IMF program design has a time-dependent nature, where the evolution of conditionality, especially during program implementation, is actually affected by the history of interactions between the actors involved in the program, in addition to the political and economic indicators of the borrowing country. So therefore, the machine learning algorithms that are able to capture path dependencies and make accurate predictions about future data points are expected to provide the best performance. I should probably pause here for the machine learning part, because it's an interesting ongoing part that I love to talk about, but I still want to spare enough time for the natural language processing bit, of course. For those who are not familiar with NLP, missed earlier presentations, just to quickly introduce what NLP refers to, it is a subfield of AI, as you may know, which aims to make human language understandable by computers. A very basic definition of natural language processing. It starts with the formation of a corpus, which again states the rules and associations between words and text. And the process involves parsing text into a syntax tree, removing stop words. Stop words refer to words that do not add value to meaning, basically, and stemming the words and extracting the meaning of the text by using one of the main information retrieval /ML algorithms used in NLP. So while some NLP tools have been developed for daily usage and in special domains, such as analysis of Fed meeting minutes, as a matter of fact, central bank speeches are a really good source of material for sentiment analysis in general. We see lots of papers being published from such sources. Automatic analysis of executive board meeting minutes with NLP really requires integration of domain knowledge into the building of the corpus, however. So This we achieve thanks to the hard work of all of our researchers in our lab, which I will explain in a bit. So that's why we are not taking a lexicon-based approach. We choose machine learning approach because without annotating the documents, we really cannot get any reliable, accurate results. I will explain that in a bit. Again, as I said, I mean, there are different fields using sentiment analysis, finance, election prediction, so on and so forth. It's not something that we only use in political science. As a matter of fact, I'm a political economist. I identify myself as such. Calling myself a political scientist would probably not be fair to actual political scientists. But it's a method that is actually, I guess, mostly used by political scientists and economists. So what I try to do is also, again, build a bridge in between these two disciplines. Our polarity classification for this research is the classes that you see here: negative, neutral, and positive. It doesn't have to be the case, but for pragmatic reasons, let's say, this is what we stick to. Annotating the data we have is really, or it's an artist's task, which Onur Can would agree with, I'm sure. And the content is particularly complex. There are different text representation techniques like the ones we see in the slide. We use bag of words and word embeddings models at the moment. But as you may have noticed, we use GLOW and bag of words in our IEEE Access article. And our motivation here actually with this tool is to build on, of course, the state of the art to begin with. In the literature, they're really creating better word embeddings models, targeting a domain or a task. But we haven't actually found any method that, first of all, integrates the context and the sentiment information efficiently for the sentiment analysis task. And handling unknown words. There's not the method that does not require hyperparameter tuning and does not need large volumes of data, as anyone working with NLP would agree with. I think NLP is a very, what I say, data hungry method. So that's another thing to consider for those who are interested in using NLP for their research. So our motivation is to make a major contribution with a new NLP tool that can offer what is lacking at the moment in the literature. So to this end, our corpus, first of all, is built by manual labeling of all executive board meeting minutes available in the IMF archives, which, by the way, amount to about 26,000 pages of documentation. And most of these documents were actually typed by a typewriter. The data goes all the way back to 1970s. And they're digitalized, but some of them are not easily readable by OCR. And so the data itself is actually very difficult to read sometimes. It's another problem that we've been dealing with. One of the hurdles only. Even web scraping was problematic. We asked the IMF archives, they tried to help, but in the end, one of our researchers managed to scrape. But anyway, data cleaning itself, again, is actually a lot of work, and we're really thankful to our researchers who've been working on that. So our NLP model, again, is trained on this corpus, and the model is then utilized to analyze the whole set of meeting minute documents to extract the sentiments of the executive board members regarding the design of programs. And a categorical variable that we name as executive board discontent is then formed based on the analysis of the data. And that integer value that we extract from this analysis obtained is by taking average of the number of times executive directors raised criticisms regarding the design of a program. For intercoder reliability purposes, we actually assigned the same document to two separate annotators. And as I said, all the documentation pretty much looks like something in line with what you see in the screen. I put the executive board meeting minutes for Turkey's 1994 program here. So every time an executive director or an IMF staff of a particular department, can be an area department or research department, etc., we code, first of all, these names and match with their countries if it's an executive director. And then our annotators label these either as -1, 0, or 1. The PDF file looks like this, but we convert this into a CSV file for the convenience of our coders. So our data actually looks something like this. This is the Albanian program from 2004, I guess. So again, it can be European one, department one, or the name of the executive director is written. We just then match it with the corresponding country. And that's how the annotation is done. I've noticed that I'm almost passing my, all right, I'm typing myself. That's why I don't want to speak more than 40 minutes as promised. But what we aim to do, I'm just wrapping it up. What we aim to do in this project is to develop a tool that can also be applied to other international organizations' meeting minutes. The next one in our pipeline is the World Health Organization, which I think is very much speaking to all the debates about the efficiency of the organization, why earmarking has made it lose its focality in global health governance, so on and so forth. So the tool that we develop is intended to be applied to World Health Organization as well, together with World Bank, which is a very similar structure with the IMF, the same stakeholders pretty much having similar power. And then European Central Bank, which is, again, remember the +1 I said for the objectives of the project. European Central Bank speeches are important for us because ECB was a collaborating institution when Greece was borrowing from the IMF as part of a troika. So with that, I'll pause and thank you very much for listening. I would like to hear your questions, so let's spare time for the Q&A as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Merih Hocam. This has been, I think, very fruitful for us as well. And I think the tool you are creating is very complex to begin with, but I think it's going to work with other organizations as well. I was going to ask that, but you already answered that. Are there any questions from the audience? There's one question in chat. It says, should I read it or?
Yes, of course. So people who would like to listen to the recording can also know.
Right. It says, can you elaborate on why you choose these specific countries?
Sure. So the reason why I chose Turkey is not because I'm from Turkey, really. That wasn't, I mean, people usually assume that, I mean, you do have a particular advantage when you study a case where you have prior knowledge and you know the language of the language, so on and so forth. But the reason why I chose Turkey is because although it has been a strategic ally of G5 countries, at least in my time frame up until 2008, we do not see any variation there. We do see a great variation over time in the number and scope of conditionality that it received, which really is basically contesting this conventional wisdom in the IMF literature, assuming that if a country is an ally, it will always get better treatment from the IMF. And Turkey also actually gives good amount of variation because it signed 19 standby arrangements over the course of how many years? Well, it started borrowing from the IMF in 1961, and the lost program was, well, it ended in 2008. So for the other two cases, in the case of Romania, Romania is an interesting case because it had a history of borrowing while it was a communist country. Some believe that it was, as a matter of fact, the IMF program that brought the ultimate demise of Ceausescu regime, because he rushed in paying the IMF back with the austerity measures. It basically really starved people. And it was only a couple of years after the IMF program ended, the Ceausescu regime collapsed. But as a transition economy, Romania again borrowed from the IMF. And as an EU member, it again borrowed from a troika of lenders that included the IMF. So that country also actually offered variation in different variables actually over time. In the case of Greece, there are more actors involved, including the ECB. I mean, on top of the European Commission, it firstly started borrowing from the funds as part of a troika of lenders, but then it became a quadriga. The ESM also joined the team, and so again, the social upheavals, a left-wing populist government in power signing agreement with the IMF. These are all interesting political economic processes that made me convinced that a comparison of the three cases would be interesting. So I basically termed them together as a comparative analysis of Southeast European cases in the end. But the structures of bureaucracies actually differ. As a matter of fact, Greece is a very different case than Romania and Turkey. Turkey and Romania are much more similar, you'll be surprised, when it comes to the structures of bureaucracy, at least in my time frame. It probably would be different today, because I mean, there is also a certain change in the bureaucratic structures now in Turkey. Not so much for Romania, but I would say that definitely for Turkey. So it's a very long answer to the question in the chat box, but I think it's actually a really important one, because case selection criteria is something that you really need to have a solid answer to if you are doing process tracing. So thank you very much for that question. I guess there's a second question from Giza.
Yes, it says, what are the differences between the dictionary-based and corpus-based, approaches? How can we decide which one we should employ in our research?
Mm-hmm. Let's take more questions and then I can maybe answer them. I also see one from Pınar Hoca.
I don't think that's a question.
Oh, okay. Well, that's actually a thank you. Well, thank you, Pınar Hocam. Let me go back to Gizem's question then. So for the dictionary-based and corpus-based approaches, so for the dictionary-based, we basically use already we can use already formulated dictionaries and expect your automated analysis to give you a sentiment score for that. Let's say, I mean, and we did try that, for example, for the WHO research that we just started as a baseline model. We use a dictionary that is actually failing in giving us accurate sentiments, because dictionaries have a very simplified way of annotating, if you will, words. The reason, and I was actually, that's a great question you asked, because I actually didn't have time to talk about why we are preferring annotating the executive board meeting minutes, because context matters. So for another project that we are looking at, the Rising Populism in IMF Borrowers project. Again, I consider as one of the sister projects of our grand project, but there we try to look at what happens to the borrowing country when the IMF leaves, what happens to the sentiments of the government or the discourse. There, for example, we actually also tried a dictionary-based approach with Turkish, actually, and the only Turkish lexicon that was available was used. But the trouble we have is that there are certain words that are labeled as neutral, which are very negative, for example, in the case of Turkey. A country is, in a dictionary, labeled as neutral, right? Like Argentina is labeled as neutral. But in our contexts, when government officials or the president, when they're talking about, in the context of the IMF, when the word IMF is mentioned, when they bring it up, the word Argentina, they almost always refer to what happened to Argentina when it was borrowing from the IMF, the failures and all the negative past memories. And that, if you were annotating them, would be labeled as -1. But a dictionary is not able to do that. So that's why annotating 36,000 of pages is actually necessary. Of course, you can also use that as a baseline and then build on it and add your own words, marks your own words, and develop a corpus and then base your research on it without asking a machine to learn from the patterns that you yourself annotated. It doesn't get you anywhere, I gotta say. I tried it in multiple data. I mean, domain-based NLP is really, it's I mean, in a way, doing wonders if you feed it enough with annotated documents. And that's where I really thank my my research assistants for the really hard work that they put on. The type of data that they annotate is very complicated to annotate. I mean, there is no comparison to, I mean, the populism one I just mentioned, that's easy to annotate because you know when the president is saying something positive or negative, or, I mean, it's usually negative or positive. You don't really get much neutrals there. But in the case of the IMF documentation, the type of wording they use, it's always very technical and diplomatic at the same time. So they always start with negative, I'm sorry, positive, but it turns negative in the end. So in order to capture that, our research assistants always try to bear in mind what they are trying to get here. Bear in mind the research question, the hypothesis, and all that, and annotate accordingly. I mean, you should see, I mean, we have a Slack channel where we try to discuss whether a sentence is negative or positive or neutral. We all have difficulties sometimes. in deciding what to say. And the easiest way to label is, of course, assigning a neutral to be on the safe side. But if you assign a neutral to the entire document, the machine is not going to learn anything. So there is really no machine learning. You need to feed the machine with the right annotation. That's why we assign two separate coders. So let's assume that one of them assigned a -1 and the other assigned a +1. Then we have to, of course, assign a 0. That's how we process. If not, a minus, a 0 is assigned, then we assign a negative. That's how it works. I mean, I'm just like trying to explain it further, as I don't see any questions in the chat box at the moment. I just decided to use the time to just explain further how we do the annotation. But I mean, this is, again, a lot of work that one needs to spare time on if such a route is to be taken. Another question for Gizem. Would you like to read it, Onurcan?
Sure, Hocam. Would you think of collecting some key delegates' opinions towards these specific countries on social media?
Interesting question. I've never considered that. And that's, I think, because I'm old, because I've recently actually opened a Twitter account even. I don't use social media that much, but people are better at keeping track of what's happening in social media. That would be interesting to see. I mean, I assume they wouldn't share something that they mention at the executive board, because these are confidential information that cannot be shared for 5 years. It used to be longer than that, so they become available only after the program for the country is already ended. But it would be interesting to see if they share any of their opinions. Thank you for that suggestion, Giza.
Hocam, thank you very much.
Thank you. And again, I look forward to seeing this next year.
Hopefully, Hocam, that's our intention to do.
Kudos to you all. Thank you. See you in a bit. Onur Hoca will be starting in 20 minutes, I guess.
Yeah, actually in 5 minutes.
Oh no, we went over time. Sorry. Yeah, of course. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, so let's give a 5-minute break, and then we will back.
Okay. See you. Bye.